Hi everyone, and welcome to Bad Dubs, the revamped version of an old idea that we had about a place where we could talk about Asian movies, specifically films from Hong Kong, China, Japan, Korea, and possibly even the wider Southeast Asian region, but we won't do Bollywood. Well, maybe one. Today, Rob is going to be talking about Seijun Suzuki, so without further ado, take it away, Rob.
Yeah, thanks Rob. This month we'll be talking about Seijun Suzuki with a specific eye trained on the two box sets that Arrow put out in the past 2 months based on his early career. If you want a little bit of extra reading, I'd also recommend the book that Tom Mez did about Meiko Keiji, because that's an excellent read too. Gives you a lot of background around the studio system, which we'll be dipping our toe into this week. Without further ado, let's just get into the movies. The first movie we'll talk about today is called The Boy Who Came Back, from 1958. Yes, to talk about The Boy Who Came Back, you have to talk about the position which the Japanese film industry was in at the time. In the 1960s, when you talk about Japanese cinema, you have to bring up the Japanese New Wave, which was this wave of filmmakers who were doing wildly experimental movies inspired by the French New Wave and from movies all over the world. But this being 1958 is a little bit before that. But what's interesting about this is a story about how a boy who came out of prison and finds a world which is occupied by American military. But yes, what's interesting about this is instead of it being a sort of wildly experimental film like Suzuki was later known for in his career, it's an incredible mimic of sort of 1940s and 1950s style American dramas. Breaking this movie down, there isn't a lot to it beyond the sort of dissatisfaction of the people who in a Japan who's got American military bases up and down the country. There's not a lot of work. It's basically a matter-of-fact movie when you break down this one. But what is interesting about it is, though, again, when you talk about Seijun Suzuki, you think of this wild individual. His story is a fascinating one. He made 40 films between 1956 and 1968 when he was unceremoniously fired by Nikkatsu, and there's a story of its own there. But when you think of him as a director, you don't think of somebody who does very studio films. This one in particular, it's studio in a way which is uniquely Japanese because its star, Akira Kobayashi, very handsome young lad, he is in this too. There's a sequence in this, and in a lot of these films actually, where he plays a musical number, because he would go on to be a very famous musical star in Japan. So they do get these bits in movies quite consistently, which is interesting when you compare it to American studio films. Very, very interesting. And there's an interesting quote from Seijun Suzuki when he was making all of these films. He said that because he made so many and he turned down so many scripts, he had to find a way to make these things interesting, something which he was invested in, which is totally true for the next movie on this box set, on the first box set, which has the massively long title, The Wind of Youth Group Crosses the Mountain Pass. Yes, that's very long. Fundamentally, this is about how Koji Wada, who was a regular collaborator in these early movies, is a student who's going around basically selling underwear because his factory that he used to work at has went under, and he happens across a circus troupe. It's not really got more of a plot than that, but in regards to a director finding something which is interesting in the movie, there's some nice visual flourishes. There is a shot in which Koji Wada has a fight with one of the more bullish characters in the troupe, and he throws all sorts of colours on the screen, all sorts of filters, and it creates this very impactful moment on camera. To return to my previous point of, just finding something interesting in this movie, it's all built around this whole gambit. We have this troupe, which isn't very popular. The only reason it is popular is because they've got a striptease act. So when they lose that, they've got to make it more relevant. It's built up to this show at the end of the movie, in which it has all sorts of acts, a cabaret show basically. The infectious energy which Suzuki has when he makes this little show come to life, the music, the magic, all these sorts of things. It might not be the most taxing story or subtext heavy thing imaginable, but you can tell when a director is just genuinely loving what they're putting on screen. And being in a studio system where they're just sort of going through script after script after script, 3 or 4 movies a year, to see a director do something which they are blatantly in love with, it makes up for the fact that it is kind of a passable movie. Moving on, there is Teenage Yakuza from 1962, just the year before Youth of the Beast, and which is probably his big breakout movie, before Branded to Kill and Seijun Vice and Tokyo Drifter. This one is possibly the slightest of the 10 movies I'm going to talk about today. And it's interesting because one of the plot beats in modern sort of young adult fiction, whatever you want to call it, whatever framing you want to put upon it, is how teenagers basically solve issues in the adult world. In this one, it's kind of broad and comedic, but a young lad played by Tamiyo Kawaji basically takes umbrage with the fact that Yakuza moved in. And the Yakuza in question aren't good Yakuza though. One of the Yakuza basically has a clip-on mustache, so if trouble gets going, you know, if situation becomes hard, he just clips on his mustache and off he goes. I think the most biting this film becomes, it's basically in the way it laughs at country Yakuza, country bumpkin Yakuza, which if you watch any Yakuza movie, you know that they are kind of a running gag throughout it. You know, they're not the inner city, the tough Yakuza with massive tattoos on their back and they're rough, the start, which Kazuya Kiriyama of the Sega franchise is based on. More, you know, just kind of Yakuza who has a clip-on mustache in his pocket. But the problem here is not that. I think that's kind of a cute aspect to this movie, and a quality which Suzuki is underrated for, his comedy chops. I think the problem with this is it kind of becomes disinterested in the fact that he is a young lad fighting back against the Yakuza. It becomes more concerned with the fact that one of the lead's friends becomes a Yakuza and trying to save him from the Yakuza rather than save the town. So it gets a bit too inwards looking as far as that idea goes. And yeah, it's passable. It's entertaining. That's the thing. One thing you can say about all these films. At their very least, they are all very much entertaining. Now, with this next movie, here is where things start to get really interesting, I feel. 1963's The Incorrigible. Now, this is Seijun Suzuki at his satirical peak, I feel. Now, it takes place in the Taisho area, which, if you don't know your Japanese history, which is fair, it's early 20th century, so we have cars, but society and the way everything is built up is very much all in a traditional Japanese world, you know, all the costumes, the houses, all that, all the trimmings. Now, in this one, the satire comes from the fact that the story, the incorrigible of the title, he's basically moved from his school with his mum to a country backwater school because he basically having a relationship with a girl. He was caught holding hands with a girl. To modern ears, that sounds ridiculous, you know, but in this movie, in this world, in Japan at this time, he does the same thing at the next school which he finds him at and finds himself under the wrath of the disciplinary committee, which, if you're not familiar with Japanese stuff, either through anime, movies, or the real people who live over there now, The disciplinary committee is basically a group of elder students who punished the students who they believed didn't behave in studently ways, who didn't behave in ways which benefited the school or represented the school badly. So there's a lot of conflict between these two parts. And what I believe this movie does particularly well is it has this lead character who's basically a very modern character. He's the sort of character who you'd see in a modern movie now. But he's being placed in a world where everything that is modern is frowned upon. The way I see this movie is sort of as a reaction to the ingrained social norms that are in Japan. I mean, Japan is a country who wants to move forward, but it's very much stuck in the past. And it has this character who doesn't come out and literally say. There's some movies where there is that subtext that's literally said out loud. But in this one, I think it's a very good underpinning to a movie which is basically a failed romance, or a doomed romance. Which again, it's not the sort of thing you'd associate with Suzuki, so he does it interestingly. He has like very bolshy characters in there. Lots of conflict with that disciplinary committee, so he gets a lot of ground out of this concept, I feel. Alright, this first chunk of movies are all framed under youth movies. That's what they all are, about teenagers, because that's what Nikkatsu were doing at the time, and studios were doing at the time. TV was taking over movies, so to keep movies relevant, they're tailored movies and movie going towards younger people, and movies like these five really do get behind that status, get behind that fact. Now, yes, this next one is called Born Under Crossed Stars. Now, I really enjoyed this one because it is a legitimate comedy. A funny one at that. Just to bring up 2 points which really made me laugh. There's the characters of the lead, which is a return from the incorrigible, are basically like the couple from Father Ted who run the shop, who are at each other's throats, but they never want to do it in front of the priest. Only here, there, and don't really have any issue with being seen fighting each other, which is very funny. And also, there's his boss, the lead's boss, he used to work or live in America, and he always goes on about that's not the Texan way to do things, which in a very traditional Japanese thing is just fun. It's a fun thing. Now, in this one, it's a three-way romance in which a young lad is basically in a romantic triangle. On the one hand, he's got the daughter of a loan shark. Well, a loan dealer, really. Not a shark. That'd be very harsh on him. He's not that bad at heart. But that character has a great deal of chemistry with the lead. And there's a scene in a bathhouse which I can only dub it as Japanese boner comedy. There's no other way to say it, I'm sorry if that offends you. Which, traditionally for that style of thing, it's genuinely very sweet. You look at some of the films from Sion Sono's recent filmography, and it's just kind of... well, it leaves a sickening taste in the stomach, shall we say. So there's that great chemistry between the two. But he also has I don't know what to describe it as, there's a very tense moment of pubescent sexual tension with this other girl, a classier girl, who he has a few conversations with about classic literature, which is an odd thing which again pops up throughout these movies, the love of old classic literature, of renegades essentially. And in that, it's about that romantic relationship. It's about how the character is basically a horrible human being, but people keep on falling for him. Because the whole takeaway from this one, it's very satirical, almost, well, it's very cynical, almost nihilistic satire on the way that Japanese people are very industrious to a fault. But basically, all the things which happen to the lead go horribly wrong. He messes up a lot of people's lives, and he doesn't see that as, okay, I messed up, I learned from that. He sees that as, okay, there was a climb over. It's very cynical, but it's done in a way which is quite fun and funny, you know, because like I said, it's got that Father Ted bit which I noticed, and it has the boner gags, and Seijun Suzuki knew his way around a boner gag. Right, so we're done with the youth movies, and now on to the crime movies on the second box set. Now the first one here is 8 Hours of Terror, and the only way I can describe it is sort of a very low-key version of William Friedkin's masterpiece, Sorcerer. In this, it sees a bus, a terrible rickety bus, go around the mountains of Japan as they try to catch up with a train at the next stop. And in the mountains, there are two criminals who are just skulking around after they've robbed a bank. Interesting one here is it's a microcosm of a Japanese society in a bus, and there's some deceptively timeless things in there. There's an older man who berates a younger one for not working despite him not having the same opportunities, and the American military base is pulling out, so there's no work anymore. There's complaints about commie songs. Yeah, it's just one of these things where it has these, not so much subtext, but character through lines which are just so incredibly timeless, which for a total B movie made in 1957 Japan, it's odd. And also a thing which I haven't mentioned so much in the first half, but was true, like some of those movies were full of weird editing and cool editing, especially Born Under Cross Stars, which has some real weird editing choices. I'm not saying this because there's weird editing choices here. This is very matter of fact, because regards to the quote that I brought up earlier, Suzuki did things in these movies to keep himself interested. I think there was enough interesting in this one that he didn't have to sort of bury it in, I wouldn't say bury it in style, because that's never a bad thing, but he didn't have to overcompensate and stylize it, so it made it interesting through that at least. But yeah, it's this really interesting thing. I mean, there's some violent things that happen in it. Somebody's caught in a bear trap and executed. A gun is held at a baby's head. Somebody attempts to commit suicide. But it's done all of this through sort of the light hues of a 1950s Japanese studio picture, which is a really intriguing mix of two worlds there, I feel. As well as being, you know, like I mentioned with the employment thing, which is still an issue today, and I think it'll always be an issue, just to get on my soapbox for a moment. So it does give it this timelessness, which just isn't true of a lot of 1950s Japanese movies in which a group of people chase a train through the mountain roads. It's an odd little niche that it's found itself in. On to the next one, The Sleeping Beast Within, which is from 1960, and as a title it has literally nothing to do with anything which happens in the movie, but I do like it because it sounds like an old Chinese proverb, and more movie titles should be based on old Chinese proverbs. But in this one, it's one of my favourite genres which are just dead to the world right now, and that is investigative journalism movie, because, let's all be fair, journalists are kind of scumbags these days. Scumbags are clickbait. Getting off my soapbox again. But in this one, it's a investigative journalism movie in which a journalist who basically, in this movie at least, holds a position similar to the police in sort of how much they instill fear into people who might be wrong-uns, and has its lead go up against the Yakuza. Well, I wouldn't say Yakuza, it's just corrupt corporations. It's never addressed as being something as straightforward as the Yakuza. So what I really like about this one is it has one of the themes that's running throughout a lot of these films. It sees Suzuki build up the young into sort of mythic proportions, how Japan's a country which is being spoilt by complacency, it's being spoilt by tradition, and young characters will come up and question that complacency and move Japan forward to a bright, hopeful future. And it does it through the lead character in this one, who's a very aspirational and idealistic journalist, which is just something which really tickles me, I think, those old journalism movies. Also, it's got a character who plays off that, so as much as we've got young people who are aspirational and leading the future forward to bright things, it's got people who are just kind of doing what they're told. So it's got a very, I wouldn't say mean-spirited, but it's got a satirical spike to this movie, which really satisfies me. And also, it's got a final which is just horribly bleak, which almost suggests that despite, being young and aspirational, complacency will come and get you. And it's got a scene which is basically shot on the same staircase as Youth of a Beast. I noticed these things, so you don't have to. Next is kind of a companion piece to The Sleeping Beast Within, because it has that idealistic young journalist and turns him into an amoral, horrible human being who will literally do anything to get the story. He basically betrays a Yakuza, gets them sent to prison, almost gets his sister in a situation which it's not a nice thing to bring up, but I've got to bring up what happens. Almost makes a situation happen where his sister is threatened to be gang raped. But that's like clashing with the O-line, also on smashing as the O-line, just doing something violent to the O-line. Problem with this one is its synopsis is a more interesting thing than the movie, because it's about how, these two journalists, one idealistic, one amoral, try to crack this thing. And also, there's this idea that the amoral journalist will get his comeuppance, even though doesn't really. Maybe there's a satirical point in that, but I think it's just too bleak for me to really process the ramifications of what he's saying in this one, Suzuki. But it's a shame, because as a concept, two journalists infiltrating the Yakuza, great. Actuality, it's a bit bland. Entertaining still. All these movies are entertaining, like I mentioned earlier, but bland entertainment, like vanilla or toast. Up to the penultimate one now, and this one is Tokyo Nights with a K. In this, Koji Wada is basically made the heir of a big construction company. And Koji Wada in this is basically the best human being who ever existed. I joke, but literally, he is brilliant at rugby, he's brilliant at fencing, he's brilliant at boxing, he's attacked by a group of other students, it comes back to the scene, and he's basically beat them all up. He engages in corporate espionage, or he deflates corporate espionage, and he's really clever, and he's great at jazz piano, even though it's got one of my favourite things in bad, cheap, low-budget movies, where audio, really classy, jazz piano, reality, camera shot where his fingers are sort of hovering. I do love that. I'm not saying it in a negative way, it's just one of those lovely little continuity errors. But in this one, it's really interesting because it never sits still. It's constantly changing what it is, from like high school drama to romance to movie with lots of jazz. This is a thing which I've also not mentioned so far. Most of these movies have a scene in a jazz club, which I know a lot of these movies have scores which are made of jazz. So that does really give these sort of a very unique attitude and a unique flavour. But it eventually resolves itself with a massive amount of convolution and twists and plans and ploys, which part of involves Koji Wada as the best human being ever on the roof of Tokyo buildings in a Japanese no theatre mask with a cape, stealing Yakuza's cufflinks. So it's a weird film. It keeps moving. It keeps you guessing. And that's what I like, in movies are, again, like all things to all people without being lowest common denominator. Last movie, and this one is called Man with a Shotgun. And it stars Hideaki Natani as basically the Western movies Man with no name. Only, in this case, it's not like cool Western threads like Clint Eastwood would wear. It's like the 1960s Abercrombie and Finch Dad Wears range. So it doesn't really work. He has a shotgun though. Title's definitely right in that. This one, it's a Western, it has like ideas of opium fields and two rivals going against each other and these sort of out of the way places in Japan. But again, it's another one of these films where that Joker just made right there is way more interesting than the actual movie. But the idea of doing a Japanese Western which is very Japanese rather than just being outright awful like Takashi Miike's Sayuki Weston. But to see something just as completely without its pretension and just straightforward, I can imagine it was very popular, especially because going back to that Nikkatsu thing of having it start, sing a nice song, it's got that there again too. So it'd have kept the fan base happy at the time, even if it doesn't stand up to all that much scrutiny these days. So there we are, 10 movies from Seijun Suzuki from his Nikkatsu years. We will return to Suzuki later on in a video of less movies to go through, I think, down the line. But if you like the sound of any of that, I do recommend getting those 2 Arrow box sets because they are excellent educations into Seijun Suzuki past the surface, a little bit deeper, a deeper cut into his filmography. So comment below, subscribe, check out some of the videos here on the Geek Show. Until next time, this is Bad Dubs. I am Rob. Do support us on Patreon, and we'll see you next month.